My great pleasure to open this lecture series on the topic of diversity in higher education. The welcome goes across Europe. We have gathered here experts from Reykjavik and to the very south of Europe, from the very north to the very south of Europe, to speak about this topic. And I think it does the topic justice that we pay international attention towards this. For today, I would like to welcome the Vice Rector, one of the Vice Rectors of the University of Innsbruck, Professor Anna Buchheim, who will open this lecture series, and of course my colleague Dirk Rupnow, Dean of our faculty and from the discipline of Contemporary History. My name is Silke Meyer. I'm Professor for European Ethnology at the University of Innsbruck, and together with Dirk Rupnow, I have organized this lecture series. Professor Buchheim, the floor is yours to tell us a little bit about the framework of this lecture series.
So thank you very much, and welcome to everybody, dear students and dear colleagues from all over the world. I'm very pleased to say some introductory words about Aurora, and I hope you see the slides now. Is it working with the slides or? Okay, so since its launch in 2016, Aurora's activity have focused on its strategic priorities. Its work received a significant boost in 2020 with its successful bid to the European Commission to become one of the 40 first European University Alliances. As such, we receive financial support from the European Commission through the Erasmus Plus and Horizon programs. And the activity program set out in our bid is the shared ambition and endeavor of our students, academics and university leaders and administrators, and reflects the Aurora vision of the European University. And these are 4 pillars, and I just wanted to say the 4 ones, which is firstly Aurora Learning for Suicidal Impact, Aurora Engaging Communities, Aurora Sustainability Pioneers, and Aurora Research and Innovation for Suicidal Impact. So the next slide shows our Aurora Alliance members. So who we are. First of all, we can say that combining scientific excellence with suicidal commitment and relevance is the guiding principle of the University Network Aurora. At the end of October 2019, the University of Innsbruck joined the network, which was founded in 2016 on the initiative of the Free University of Amsterdam, and today comprises a total of 9 members of all over Europe, and you can see Amsterdam, Iceland, and so on. So you can see all these universities included here. And we can say that the strength of the Aurora University Network lies in the quality and relevance of its projects. So as you probably all know, the current focus areas are diversity and inclusion, suicidal impact and relevance of research, students, innovation of teaching and learning, internalization and sustainability. So through the European University Initiative, the European Commission has presented an ambitious long-term vision to build the universities of the future. The Aurora Partnership shares the aims of the European Universities Initiative to equip a new generation of Europeans willing and able to work together on the biggest societal challenges in different languages and across borders, sectors, and academic disciplines. And we endorse the vision of bringing about structural, systemic, and sustainable change through, first of all, making service to society central to the university missions across education, research, and innovation, and encouraging the participating universities to serve as role models, and this is important for us, for other higher education institutions in Europe, so as to promote transformation across the sector. So in the next slide, who we are, you can see that one of the selected 41 European University Alliances under the flagship Erasmus and Plus program, aiming at revolutionizing the quality and competitiveness of European higher education. And it's a consortium of research-intensive universities committed to the societal impact of our universities with a history of engagement with our communities. and determined to build universities of the future, promoting European values and identity. And what is Aurora Uniting? You can see it's a lot. 260,000 students, 30,000 staff, around 680,000 alumni, and 813 research groups and 112 faculties. So this is a really big amount. So the last slide from my side, our objectives for the 3-year period. What are we want to do and what is our aims? First of all, to equip a diverse student population with the skills and mindset to make them societal entrepreneurs and innovators, willing and able to tackle the major challenges of our societies. We'd like to make collaboration with external stakeholders and students, regular practice in education, research and outreach at local, national, European and global levels, and lead by example and inspire others as pioneers in sustainability and reducing the footprint of our individual and collective activities and making substantial contribution to addressing the SDGs. And so we will build an enduring and sustainable infrastructure to support the collaborative activities of the Alliance. So this is very shortly, and I hope you have a little overview what the Aurora Universities are, who we are, and what the aims will be. And now I would like to hand over to Dirk Rupno and Silke Meyer again, who organized this excellent lecture series. And I'm looking forward to participate then in the next lectures again. And I wish you now a very good start. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you so much, Silke. So also a very warm welcome from my side here as one of the co-organizers of this lecture series. We heard a little bit about the Aurora Network, and inside the Aurora Network there is a working group focusing on culture, diversity and identity, bringing together the different partner universities. And you know, and as part of this working group, we thought about, you know, what would be a good start to talk about these topics, diversity and identity, inside the Aurora Network, but also to a interested public audience. And this is what we came up with, at least here in Innsbruck, but also together with our friends and partners and colleagues at the other universities. We thought it might be a good idea to think about diversity in higher education, and bring together different examples and perspectives from the Aurora partner universities across Europe. And that's of course very interesting because in the different countries the frameworks are different for talking about these issues, for talking about diversity, for talking about higher education. At the same time, Anna Buchheim already said it, diversity is one of the main focuses of the Aurora Network, besides sustainability and other issues. And so I think we, and I'm very grateful to all the colleagues from the different universities who agreed to participate here. So I think we came up with a very interesting program for you for this term. And you will see that, you know, the following Wednesday lunchtime meetings that we have here online. I mean, besides all the things we have to bring together across Europe when we talk about diversity, identity, and higher education, it's also these very mundane problems like when do our semesters start and when do they end? So this is the start of our semester in Austria, and in Innsbruck at the beginning of October. I guess in other places it's only starting later or has already started. So that's also one of the challenges to synchronize these things. But we can only offer you a program with our schedule here in Innsbruck. And again, thanks to everybody who participated from the other universities. So if you went to our website, you already know what the program is. So we start today with a light introduction into the extremely complex and diverse topic of university and diversity. So I think what we put together, Silke, is actually more an introduction to the topic of diversity, also a little bit historically, and what the different aspects and perspectives to diversity are. But I think that makes sense at the very beginning of our lecture series here. Next week, Vice Rector Barbara Burenau from the University of Duisburg-Essen will be our guest lecturer, so to say, and she will talk about diversity and well-being in German and North American academia. The University Duisburg-Essen was the first university in Germany to implement a vice rectorate for diversity issues. So that's a very interesting case, and we are very happy to have Duisburg-Essen as part of the Aurora network. On October 20, we have a very special event, and that's a hybrid session, so to say. But you can also and please feel invited also to take part only digitally, but we will have it also as a presence lecture at the University of Innsbruck. And I'm sorry, it will be in German, but coincidentally, the foreign minister of Luxembourg visits Innsbruck and asked to have a meeting at the university, and it's right at the time of our lecture series. So we thought it's a good idea to invite him because obviously for Europe and the European Union, and also for Jean Asselborn, that matter, issues of diversity are very important and rank very high, and we thought it might be a good idea to have a discussion with him about these issues. So you see the program there. It will take place in Innsbruck in presence, but will also be streamed here via YouTube. Then we go on with another contribution from the University of Innsbruck, two colleagues, sociologists, Vera Brandner and Bernadette Müller-Kmet. They conducted a very interesting research project in the recent years. It's called Chill die Basis, Chill the Base, so to say. And it's about the empowerment of non-traditional students, and they will tell us a little about the findings of their project. Then we go on to our colleagues in Tarragona, Barbara Biglia, the need for a feminist intersectional approach to tackle sexual and gender-related violence within higher education institutions. Next in line is Nepal, Federico Secondo, Francesca Scamadella and Flora Di Donato. Very interesting talk about protecting vulnerable people rights as a challenge to higher education, clinical legal education as a path towards social inclusion. Then we come back to Innsbruck, a new colleague in our Peace Studies unit, Rina Aluri, moving towards new territory, perspectives on diversity inclusion. We also have contribution from Amsterdam, Marike Slootman, Diversity Inclusion in the Netherlands, Inclusive Education in Online and Offline Classrooms. Next again is Duisburg-Essen, Mariana Dahlheim, The Stories We Tell Ourselves, Diversity and Equity in Higher Education. We go back once again to Naples, Federico Secondo, Maura Striano and Annalisa Amodeo, Valuing Differences to Promote Well-Being and Inclusion, the experience of the Anti-Discrimination and Culture of Differences section at the University of Naples, Federico Secondo. And then back again to Innsbruck, Alexandra Weiss and Sabine Engel from our Equal Opportunities Office at the University of Innsbruck, here doing diversity at the University of Innsbruck from theory to practice. And we have two more, Pavlina Fleischerova and Jiří Fleischer from the Palatsky University in Olmütz, Diversity, Identity and Success in Higher Education, British and American Perspectives, which opens it up a little bit to a non-European setting also, and Brynja Halsdottir Gudjonsson und Karin Roth Gisladottir from Iceland. So finally, we get to the very north of Europe, leading equity initiatives in Icelandic higher education, a view from the University of Iceland. So I think that's a pretty impressive program, and it came only together because all of you were willing to participate. So thank you very much in advance again. And I'm very much looking forward to the interesting discussions over lunchtime. I mean, the idea here is to bring together students, but also faculty members of the different partner universities, also an interesting broader audience if people are free during lunchtime to go online. And I really hope, and I think so does Silke Meyer, that we have interesting discussions and very open discussions about these important issues here over the next weeks and month. So if we talk about diversity, we also need to talk about discrimination, of course, and different forms of discrimination. And you can come up with different kinds of catalogs of forms of discrimination. So here is one possibility that we show you on. So Anna is gone. That we show you on our slide here. Discriminations in different respects with the technical terms that are usually used. We have ableism if it comes to disability, ageism if it comes to discrimination confronting age. Of course, anti-Semitism, a very important topic in these days, also on a European level when it comes for discrimination for so-called racial, it is here against Jews, but not only racially like in earlier times, but also connected to anti-Zionism and so on. Very broad discussion going on in these days about these topics. Anti-Ziganism, if it comes to Romani people, racism in general when it comes to discrimination for race, classism, talking about social class, also a topic that is very important here for us in our lecture series and for many of the partner universities, talking about diversity, migratism, if it comes to migrants, refugees, and migration. Lookism, discrimination because of physical appearance, and sexism, discrimination because of sex and gender. And you could go on, of course, and come up with different other lists, I guess. And there are also different forms to organize diversity, so to say, as a concept. Also, if you talk about diversity and identity, so to come up with different layers of a person. You see that here, one of the most established, I think, frameworks to talk about diversity and different layers of diversity by Gordon Swartz and Rove. The 4 layers of diversity organized around, as you can see here, personality and differentiating between an internal dimension, external dimension, and organizational dimension, and then different aspects that can also be causes for discrimination. And we need to look at, if we talk about diversity, especially in an organizational setting. Silke, whenever you want to jump in, I mean, just give me a sign. We are not over-organized here, but I mean, just let me know. So why does diversity become a topic? I mean, that's of course, and I guess you could approach this question from different perspectives, but especially approaching it from a historical perspective, I think it's important to look at the late 18th century, the time of the Enlightenment and the time of the American and the French Revolution. And you know all these texts, of course, because this is the time when equality becomes an important topic, and an idea how to organize societies, so to say. So if we read here from the Declaration of Independence, so and the United States, 1776, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, so that all men are created equal. That's one of the foremost ideas, of course, in this American Revolution. But as you all know, the product of this American Revolution was not a society of equality. And it's no surprise here that they talk about, of course, men, and that also women are not included from the beginning. But at the same time, you have this very high ideal of equality here at the late 19th century. That is, set in these foundational texts of also modernity, you could say, because in pre-modern societies there was not even the idea of equality. People had different statuses in the society, different positions in society, and also different rights connected to them, and that was how pre-modern societies, also medieval societies, worked. When the idea of equality comes in here at the late 19th century, the whole setting changes, and that also brings up the need to talk about diversity. Same here in France, 1789, Declaration of the Rights of Man. And again, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Again, here, this high ideal of equal rights for men. But that was already very early on criticized, because, I mean, most of all women realized that they were not included in this idea of equality from the very beginning. Very important name here is Olympe de Gouges, of course, 1791. She came up with this Declaration of the Rights of Women and of the Female Citizen, which is a direct answer, so to say, to the Declaration of the Rights of Men, excluding women in the French Revolution. And Olympe de Gouges says here, you can see that on the slide, this revolution will only take effect when all women become fully aware of their deplorable condition and of the rights they have lost in society. Woman is born free and remains equal to men in rights. Social distinctions may only be based on common utility. And Olympe de Gouges died under the guillotine in 1793. Women have the right to mount the scaffold they must also have the right to mount the speaker's rostrum. So here you can see a very early answer to the fact that that also you have this very high ideal of equality in societies after these late 18th century revolutions, that that groups in the society realized that they were not included in this idea of equality and needed to fight for it, so to say. You know how long these fights took. If we come to female suffrage, for example, which is a very important example in that matter, right? It took till the beginning of the 20th century that female citizens became the same rights in terms of voting rights in societies. In some cases, as you can see here in the list, it took even up to the 1980s or 1970s. Even in France, only at the end of the Second World War, Austria and Germany after the end of the First World War, and so on. You could also talk about other aspects, of course, looking at decriminalization of homosexuality in societies very early in France. That's very interesting, of course. But then, of course, again, you end up in the 20th century. So what about this idea of equality coming from the times of Enlightenment, when it took so long to decriminalize specific aspects of being a human, so to say, right? Or make sure that everybody really has the same rights in society. So if you talk about diversity and also about what you could call diversity management, usually there is a shorter history that comes up, and that begins after the end of the Second World War. 1948 might be an important date, the Executive Order 9981 of the American president to desegregate the armed services and to create the equal treatment and opportunity in the armed services, which was, of course, an important topic after fighting against Hitler and about Hitler's anti-Semitism and racism in World War II, to make sure that everybody who serves in the army, and they serve segregated, to make sure that everybody has the same rights and that they can also serve together. So that might be a very important date if we talk about, in a narrower sense, the evolutions of ideas of diversity, equality, and also diversity management in the post-World War II world. Another date might be 1964, the Civil Rights Act in the United States, forbidding the segregation on grounds of race, religion, and national origin in all places of public accommodation, including courthouses, parks, restaurants, theaters, sports arenas, and hotels. Assisted with school desegregation, and this act also prohibited the unequal application of voting requirements. But then again, looking at the reality in the United States, you know that even from the Civil Rights Act in 1964, it's an extremely long way to something like equality in the US, and it's actually an ongoing struggle with the now going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, and so on. But nonetheless, these are important dates for a historical understanding how we talk and when we talk about when it comes to diversity and equality in the 20th century. There are also different narratives, or there are actually two different narratives of the development of diversity management in the post-World War II world. And the one is this equity narrative, so to say, coming up with a continual development from the civil rights movement to diversity management in institutions and organizations. And we already said that the Civil Rights Act in 1964 is an important milestone for that, also creating the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission with the Affirmative Action Program in the United States. But there's also a different second narrative of the development of diversity management, which is the business narrative, so to say. In 1987, the Secretary of Labor of the United States, William Brock, published a study, Workforce 2000, Work and Workers in the 21st century. And this study established that the population, and you can see that here on the slide, the population and the workforce will grow more slowly than at any time since the 1930s. And the average age of the population and the workforce will rise, and the pool of young workers entering the labor market will shrink, that more women will enter the workforce in the future, and that minorities will be a larger share of new entrants into the labor force. So, and that also for businesses made clear that there is a need to confront diversity and to come up with ideas to guarantee a more diverse workforce in companies and institutions. But that also resulted in two different ideas when it comes to diversity management, so to see this equity case more founded in ideas of equal opportunities and social justice, an idea building on the fact that that quantitative adequate representation on participation of different discriminated groups in organizations is needed. And again, on the other side, the business case, so to say, arguing that diversifying the workforce is most of all economically important for companies if they want to remain competitive and if they want to be able to attract workers in the future, in light of the fact that the workforce will be more diversified, more women will be part of it, and so on. And I think these different strands of talking about diversity and diversity management, especially when it comes to diversity in institutions and organizations, also like higher education institutions, the universities they are still around, so to say, competing with each others, and the University of Berkeley recently came up with this excellent case, so to say, trying to bring together these different strands and different perspectives on diversity in institutions, in what they called is their diversity policy pathway to excellence, published in 2009. You see here some quotes from it, basically trying to reconcile these two different approaches, this more economical approach and the more social justice approach, and bringing them together in the framework of a university. And with this, I think I can hand over again to Silke. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Dirk, for this historical perspective and the different sort of evaluations of terms like equality and diversity. I think the last slide showed it very, very well, this narrative. I'm just going to go back once more. This excellence case. It also shows why the topic of diversity in higher education is so interesting, because it's a controversial topic. And it is controversial because two concepts collide. I mean, you can see it in the etymologies. It's the university and the diversity. And I mean, we could say that on a first glance, the university is an elite institution based on merits of knowledge, of industry and creativity. And it's the innovative mind and the diligent and the studious soul who succeeded within these walls. And this assumption follows a narrative of merit, which has become omnipresent, which is sort of the motto of the capitalist society. If you try hard enough, if you study hard enough, you will make it, and you will also make it in academia. But on the second glance, we know, of course, it's not as simple as that, that we know that knowledge is not distributed evenly, that learning strategies and academic success are heavily related to family background. So you talked about social class. I mean, who's considered to be competent to take on a professorship has changed considerably over time, say during the last century, and we still have a low number of female professors, and we still have an even lower number of professors from working class backgrounds. I mean, you could say, might be a little provocative, but I think it does hold true for many cases, that academia is still a male, a bourgeois, and a white culture. And yes, it is based on meritocracy, but that to gaining merit doesn't have the same starting conditions for everybody. And I think this is a very good question that kind of comes up from this last slide. How can you aim at excellence and inclusion at the same time? And how can you bring these two concepts together? And the University of Berkeley gave an answer that diversity is a resource that contributes to excellency. And I think to analyze this and to analyze diversity in higher education, we need to kind of take a step back, and then I will follow with my my next slide. Take a step back and return to the analytical perspective from the social science point of view. Taking a step back also allows us to take on a wider angle, you could say, and thereby taking into account the parallel pathways and the crossroads of the pathways within diversity studies. And what's, I think, a seminal approach here, which I would like to introduce, and I will talk a little bit about this in the next 15 minutes or so, is the intersectional approach. Intersectionality is certainly a buzzword. It has become the dernier cri, and then has stayed that for probably the last 30 years or so. And I think for a very, very good reason. The perspective of intersectionality can be used as a prism focusing on the intersections of differences. And I think this is a key moment to kind of shift from an approach from an additive approach. I will talk a little bit more about this in the next few minutes, to an approach where these axes of differences produce multiplication of discriminations. And I think this is the key the key outcome when you look at intersectionality. What we need to take into account is that when a person suffers from multiple inequalities, is that very fact that these inequalities, that these discriminations not simply add up, but they reinforce each other and they multiply. The axes of differences intersect in historically specific contexts, and the context of intersectionality emphasizes that different dimensions of social life cannot be separated into pure strands. In other words, you can't take and separate the disadvantages of being the wrong race, the wrong gender, or the wrong class. You need to look at the effects they have when multiplied. This term of intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw with the example of social inclusion experienced by Black women in the US legal system. She also points to the fact that they faced discrimination greater than the sum of racism and sexism. We'll hear more about Crenshaw later. I just want to point out that the concept of intersectionality is, of course, older than the 1980s here. Just a few early stages of intersectional thinking. 1851, I'll tell you more about this in a second. Sojourner Truth, Am I Not a Woman and a Sister? I think we can sort of coin this, that this is one of the narratives of origin of intersectionality. I will say a little bit more about another woman first, Clara Zetkin. I think both can be considered as introducing intersectional thinking. Both address the relation between race, class, and gender. In fact, Clara Zetkin's criticism that the women's movement was in its core a middle class project can still hold true for many feminist groups today. She'd say that for proletarian women to become free, they, together with the men of their class, need to destroy the bourgeois society and capitalism first. We could say first revolution, then emancipation. The second step results from the first, and this order cannot be turned around. So in her view, the social evil is capitalism and private property, not the battle of the sexes. We have here the quote, die erste Diktatur des Proletariats ist die wahre Bahnbrecherin für die volle soziale Gleichberechtigung der Frau. Sie rottet mehr Vorurteile aus als Bände frauenrechtlerischer Literatur. So the dictatorship of the proletariat needs to be followed first to achieve emancipation. I will go back to Sojourner Truth. She also recognized that class intersected with the liberation of women. In a famous speech delivered at the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851, she points to class differences and asks, when women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches, why nobody ever helped her? Isn't she a woman? I'll read out the quote, but what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and to have the best places everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over muddled puddles or gives me any best place. And I, a woman, look at me. Look at my arm, I have plowed and I planted, I gathered into barns and no man could head me. And I, a woman. So class obviously trumps gender here. The phrase, am I not a man and a brother, stands, gives sort of the, came before that very famous female motto. It's been used by British abolitionists since the 1980s, and the motto then turned female in 1820. It was printed in a newspaper in 1830 and then has become very widespread in popular prints. Am I not a woman and a sister? So again, joining these two intersections of differences. The activist angle is already here in this in these thinkings and in these speeches of Zetkin and Truth, and it's prolonged in another important group representing intersectional thinking, which is the Combahee River Collective, founded by Barbara Smith in Boston, 1974, and specifically aimed at identity politics. In their manifesto, we can read, "The most general statement of our politics at the present time would be that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major system of oppressions are interlocking." It is the interlocking that taps into the intersectional angle. The activist agenda is emphasized. I'm only going to briefly mention the triple oppression theory: race, class, and gender add up, and then return to Kimberly Crenshaw, who contradicted this theory and stated then, rather than adding up, discriminations intersect and multiply. And she based her claim on the employment policies in the United States and the observation that Black males and white females were favored, whereas Black women were discriminated against. She found evidence in the court case of De Graffenreid versus General Motors, who in the 1970s had sacked a large number of Black women. The court, however, did not follow her reasoning and concluded the allegations of race and gender discrimination separately, finding that the company did in fact employ Black people, meaning Black males, and they did in fact employ women, meaning white women. And as a result, the case was dismissed because these intersections were not acknowledged. Intersectionality is concerned with multiple discriminations, and the categories of difference seemed endless. And Dirk, you already listed a much longer list table than I have here. Race, class, gender, body, religion, you named them. It is the and more, or the embarrassed, etc., that I want to point out here, because these lists, of course, can never be comprehensive. And another intersectional thinker who was angered by this embarrassed, etc., as she calls it, was Judith Butler. She says that rather than elaborating predicates of color, and I've got the quote here, rather than elaborating predicates of color, sexuality, ethnicity, class, able-bodiedness, and close the list with an embarrassed, etc., we should look out for a political impetus. What does she mean by that? It is not enough to list categories and predicates, but we need to formulate an objective of intersectional thinking, a strategy to identify problematic intersections and provide alternative thinking. For that, we need to look further than the categories of difference and study them in their interdependence. And this goes back to the graph you showed earlier, Dirk, the 4 layers of diversity. And I think it helps us a little bit to engage with diversity productively on an analytical level. What I mean here is that we need to focus on the question how these categories work rather than what they are. Bray and Phoenix state that we need to focus on how a differentiation is produced rather than who and what is affected. Only then can we arrive at examining power constellations, which are at the bottom of discrimination. And I have identified 4 levels in which we can look at diversity and differences on from an intersectional angle. The first one is the macro level, with aiming at institutions, the nation state, of course, and structures of inequality and difference, which constitute society. And it is opposed to the micro level of individuals, the experiences of inequality and difference constituting identity. I realize that this is a sort of a simplification of a model, but I think we can. It helps us to really engage with intersectionality on an analytical level. The third level is the level of representation and cultural symbols. Where is inequality written into our culture, into our stories, into our narratives, into our films, into our art? And the level of discourse. How do we talk, write, broadcast about diversity? The aim is to bring all these levels together. And I realize that this is not a small endeavor and can be compared to sort of other big projects like the habitus theory or structuralization by Anthony Giddens. Both ideas how to examine the ways how society is shaped by individuals and how subjects are formed by society. So it is the engagement of all these levels that we need to consider, but from an analytical point of view, we need to identify the different levels and their effects. When we look at, because when we look at the topic of this semester, we can see that diversity in higher education needs exactly all those levels. We'll need to look at the institution of the university, its legal, its economic context. We need to consider individual experiences by student, by staff, by faculty. And we need to examine the reproduction of inequality through representations, through academic traditions, narratives of whiteness, masculinity, and middle class. For, I'll say again, academic culture has long been a culture of a masculine culture and a middle class culture. And in Austria, I dare say, it is also very white culture. To add complexity, and this is the next slide here, we need to situate intersectionality within its geographical and historic context. And I think the different stages that you pointed out, Dirk, already show how important it is to look at the historical perspective of this. Of course, universities are institutions with a very long history, which adds cultural and symbolic capital. I mean, when you just think about the emblems and images which many universities, including our own Innsbruck University, and how they claim the position on the economy of education. I think academic merchandising is a great example for this. T-shirts sport, our Innsbruck T-shirts sport sort of a mountain range, but they also sport the old seals from the 17th centuries. You know, when you look at promotion festivities, we sing Latin songs. So we need to carefully consider where this matrix of meaning making comes from, how individuals, actors position themselves in this complex web of relations. And I think it's also important that we need to consider privilege, considering our own position to be able to speak and to being heard. We need to look at mechanisms of reproducing the uni in university and study them before we can aim to find solution to include the diversity. Dirk has mentioned this before in the context of Berkeley. We need to do all this before we can actually aim to find how we can bring together excellence and inclusion. And one solution to this diversity management is identity politics. And I'm going to say a little bit about identity politics. I think it's going to accompany us through the semester. So take this only as a sort of a first draft. What we mean by identity politics is the adjustment of decision-making to the particular interest of specific social groups. And they are constituted according to class, race, gender, origin, religion, sexual orientation, etc. Identity politics means going against heteronormativity intentionally and deliberately. However, identity politics, aiming at social inclusion, also means putting up with the production of a social exclusion, of constructing an us versus them. And this is one of the big societal issues at the moment with its critics claiming that identity politics are dangerous because they are not aimed at constituting equality, but privilege one category over others, thereby emphasizing differences over shared ground. Just one example which has been discussed in the German and Austrian press extensively is the Berlin Playhouse, the Maxim Gorky Theatre, which understands itself as an identity theatre, representing diversity and thus offering identification to different social groups. The question, of course, here is which groups? In the Gorky, a Turkish shopkeeper is represented by a person with a Turkish background, but not with a shopkeeper background. Critics claim that by paying attention to maybe well-justified questions of representations of minorities on stage, there is no way back to an ideal of an equal society and its utopian potential, which the arts should strive for. And you can see that this is ground for debates, and I think it's going to keep us busy for certainly more than one semester. I just want to conclude this with two comments from our side. The first is aimed at the need for situated intersectionality. I think you can see with the Gorky example, you can see very well that this intersectionality needs to be situated geographically and historically. We need to consider where and when we need to foreground migration over class, and when it should be the other way around. This needs a careful and a complex approach of situated intersectionality. And the second one is aimed at the necessity of the historical perspective. The very fact that we're having this debate shows that we have come a long way from white theatre, and for that matter, from male theatre. In Shakespeare's plays, female roles were played by men. And this comment echoes the discrimination paradox, which states that social exclusion is a historic result from integration. And I know this sounds paradoxical on first, when you first hear it, but I think there is something to it. For example, the headscarf conflict, Kopftuchstreit, as it was called in the German-speaking press, emerged not when women wear headscarves. It becomes a problem for society, or for some parts of society, when women with scarves speak up. It was a female teacher asking to wear her headscarf during lessons which started the debate, not the fact that, for example, a cleaner wore a headscarf doing her job on the school grounds. Is identity politics a solution to the problem of inequality? And I think there'll be many answers to that question, and it will take us through the semester. I'm very much looking forward to discussing this with you and with the colleagues from the European universities, because I think it's going to be very interesting how different their answers are going to be. And I'm going to finish, show you the last slide here. I'm going to finish today's session with sort of an open slide, just putting together concepts and terms which will keep us occupied this semester. We're not going to define them today, but I think all these ideas of equity, equality, equality, of discrimination, non or anti-discrimination, of equal opportunity, affirmative action, positive discrimination, gender mainstreaming, color blindness will keep us occupied. We will always link them back to the concept of the university as a reproduction of society. We will have to ask ourselves in how far we understand ourselves as elite. And I will end this this list of terms and concepts with maybe on a bit of a lighter note. When looking at different statements by universities about diversity and equality, I came across this famous quote many a times by Verna Meyers, a leading diversity and exclusion expert. And she says that diversity is when everyone is invited to the party. Inclusion means that everyone gets to contribute to the playlist or is asked to dance. I think you can see in this that there are different scales of appreciation, of acceptance of social acceptance in the different terms, and I think it'll be very interesting to discuss these with you. So I finish my part for today. I'm asking all of you to pose questions. Dirk, of course, will have a lot to say about this, I'm sure. We can also have maybe in a few minutes a question round on the sort of the more formal affairs. I've already been asked whether we could, whether these slides are going to be, students can find these slides at OLAT. We can also post them, send them out. That's not a problem. But maybe we can take a minute, no, let it sink in, and ask you if you have any questions about this idea of diversity, of the idea of university elite, how you see yourself in this. I mean, we are all part of this institution, and post them in the chat. There's always this time when you wait, and I always imagine all of you typing away frantically on your keyboards.
I mean, I think it was a lot for the first session. We were pretty quick actually for 34 slides anyway. But yeah, I mean, also, you know, what you said at the end, I think it's the university is really a perfect institution to talk about these issues, because the access to universities were so limited for a long time, right? And it's also, of course, a problem. I mean, we had that in Innsbruck a few years ago, right, when we celebrated our anniversary, 350 years, and you tend to forget. Same happened in Vienna a few years before that, 650 years. You tend to forget that most of these centuries, many of the groups and societies were just not able to access the universities, right? I mean, women could only do it for more or less 100 years now, right? I mean, very, very hard at the beginning, but it's the history of the last 100 years. So if, for example, if we talk really about old universities having a history of more than 600 years, you talk about 500 years of a secluded institution where huge parts of the society could not have access to, right? And you could, of course, argue it's we are still not there, right? I mean, it's not, as you also said, right? It's equality is not realized at the university. It's an ongoing challenge. I mean, this is why we sit together here, right? And why this is a topic, and why it's a topic for Aurora Network and for all of us in our different institutions. But insofar, the university as an institution and higher education with these ideals of bringing together the best and the brightest and competition and science and rationality and so on. It's a very interesting example to talk about the equality in society and what that means for different groups and so on. And really poses challenges for us every day, so to say, right? At universities.
And I mean, this is why I brought up the discrimination paradox in the end. Right. I think it's, I mean, the very fact that we talk about this today means that we have, we have raised an awareness. The very fact that we have complaints that some groups do not feel represented, cannot identify, probably is a step on this way. But I think it's also important to really openly address the hierarchy of differences. We've come quite a way when it comes to gender. We have it's written in the codices. We have an office about the representation. There are other differences which are less visible. You can't see if somebody is from a working class background. You can't see if they're the first academic student in their family. So and I think it's important to address the variety of differences, and I know that already there has been some endeavor to do this, but there's still a way ahead of us. Let me just check the chat. Herr Konz, who manages and moderates the chat for us, has taken up example. Could you please give an example of positive discrimination? Positive discrimination.
Yeah,
Dirk, do you want to take it?
Okay, so I see, because it refers to our slide here, right? So it comes from this idea of affirmative action, right? So that you make sure that that specific groups, right? I mean, that's the dominating concept in the US, of course, that you make sure that different groups are represented in specific institutions like universities or companies by positively discriminating them. So choosing Black people, so to say, right? That is meant as positive discrimination in this respect. And this is what was established in the US in '64 with this act we referred to, right? The Civil Rights Act. They established also this idea of affirmative action. So positively discriminate the groups that are not there yet. So
would also,
which conflicts with other concepts, of course. Here, I mean, all these concepts are, in conflict with each other sometimes, right? Like the concept of equal opportunity, right? It's a different concept of open it up for other groups, but it's not the same idea of positively discriminating groups that are not represented yet.
I think the example that you gave is a good one. Also saying that the next professor of such subject needs to be a woman. So right. You are actively looking for a woman to fulfill this professorship. And I think this goes back to the identity politics. So you favor a group that is not represented yet. But of course, and you can imagine what the discussion is when you sit together and we try to choose somebody, that you favor one category over the other. The outcome is certainly not equality, because it's again this constructing this group versus the other group. So you have male against female. You have the sort of ethnicity, and you have all very good arguments that people bring in experiences which add to the merit. But of course, you have they're very contradictory concepts, and certainly positive discrimination is highly disputed, understandably so, because people would say it is not a contribution to an equal society because it favors one group over the other.
Right.
But as Dirk said, I mean, all these concepts are contradictory in itself sometimes, and they contradict each other. So this is not an easy field, certainly not in terms of terminology. And we will kind of pick out one or the other, also according to what our guest speakers are going to talk about.
Yeah, and I mean, as we also said at the very beginning, right? I mean, it gets more complicated when you open it up to different countries, right? And this is why you talked about the situatedness, right? Why it's so important to keep that in mind, right? I mean, we talk about different histories of minorities and so on in the different countries. We also talk about different legal frameworks in which the universities are situated in the different European countries and in different countries worldwide, right? I mean, of course, there's also a European legal framework for that, but there are different national legal frameworks, there, and they produce totally different approaches to this challenge of diversity in higher education, and that will be a little bit confusing, I'm sure, but over the next weeks, but also very interesting to see these different approaches and different systems in the different European countries. And that's, of course, the great, I guess, the great advantage of also of the Aurora network, to learn from each other, when it comes to these issues. Although we shouldn't forget that we, in some parts we work in slightly different circumstances, right, when it comes to that. And the same is true, of course, for the term and the concept of identity politics, right? I mean, for some it's a valid concept, and for some it's a negative term, right? In the ongoing discussion, to blame certain positions. I mean, that might be the most controversial discussion right now, right? But if there are no, again, it's a lot for the beginning, and we are only at the beginning and only open it up. So, so we can also take questions that are more technical in nature. And maybe we should say, I mean, there are some students around, I guess, that that are formally here and need a grade at the end. So when it comes to that, you find more information on our website, what we expect from you, the requirements. So it's so we said here what we want from BA students. It's summary and reflection, so an essay of 3 sessions of our program. For MA and PhD students, it's summary and reflection of 5 sessions. So that's the idea, and I guess the students should send that to us as PDFs, best to both of us, to Silke Meyer and myself, via email when you need a grade here at the end of the term.
I think maybe that's something we also need to stress or point out, at least. This is one of the first courses from the Aurora side. The idea, Anna Buchheim talked about this at the beginning, is to have something like a European campus where people can join other universities, courses at other universities. Once we have completed this, it will be easier to access programs like OLAT, because I think, I mean, what we are trying to do at the moment is that we could also have a folder where you can upload your essays on OLAT. Then it'll be easier for us to see them. That's might avoid confusion, but I'm actually not sure if that is already feasible. So, I mean, have a little patience with us. We are experimenting in the Aurora format. The very fact that this lecture series is going to happen is a huge success for us, and that you could register, and we will keep you updated on what the technicalities are.
Right, but if you have any questions, you can always email us. You can also email Christian Konz, who is supporting us with the technical aspects here of streaming the whole lecture series, but all other aspects also of the lecture series. So just let us know. Okay, now we have even a long question for the very end. Let's I think we need to read it because the others cannot read it, right? So diversity is visible if one compares the local students and the students who moved to Innsbruck. The foreign newcomers, including myself, seem to be very privileged and wealthy. There are so many students doing expensive outdoor sports with equipment of thousands of euros. This milieu is mainly white. On the other hand, the students' fees in Austria are affordable, and that should give more opportunities. Looking at the gender aspect, there are more female students than male, I think, in 2018. That's not really is that a question? It's more a comment, right? I understand.
Yeah, but I think it's it's very apt to point out again the visibility of difference. Yes, that's certainly true that people who decided to go to Innsbruck decide to put up with high rents, for example, high cost of living, and of course that goes back to sort of a different economic background. Absolutely, I think that's very right, and you can see this in leisure time, outdoor sports, etc.
And there are also different layers here, which is interesting because I mean the access to universities in Austria might be affordable, but it might not be affordable to live in Innsbruck, which is extremely expensive, as we all know, right?
So again,
it all comes together.
Yeah.
When you want to, if you want, talking about Innsbruck, if you want to study here or any other of the places we could talk about.
And it has this layer of the institutional say how high is the fee to study in Austria. It's very different to say Great Britain, where you pay a lot more money. But then there are sort of inbuilt other difference makers, or different markers, like rent, like cost of living, and also, I mean, the question about gender background, I'm actually not sure. I mean, I'm from a discipline which is very female, and I would echo that. I think it might have a little bit to do which discipline we're talking about. At the moment, if I'm right, correct me if I'm wrong, we have maybe a little bit more female students than male students, but it is sort of roughly 50-50.
Yes. Jetzt hat Christian da eine Frage, die verstehe ich nicht ganz, ehrlich gesagt. Die Termine nicht da, was soll das heißen? Kannst du es nochmal, ich verstehe die Frage nicht ganz, Christian.
There is a question here that the sessions are not equal. And it's not enough to join one. I mean, as we said, and I put the link to our website in the chat. I hope I put that in the public chat.
Yeah, but they cannot see it, right? I think the public chat.
So Christian, could you publish that link again? Because it says here that for the exam, we need to have a summary of reflection, as Dirk said before, of 3 sessions for BA students and of 5 sessions for MA and PhD students. So at the very least, you would have to join these sessions.
Right. And again, I mean, the idea is to bring together students and also faculty, but also colleagues that work in administration at our universities around these issues of diversity and so on, and just to get into a conversation here, what that means for us as part of the Aurora network. Okay. So if there are no more technical questions, maybe that's it for today. Silke, what do you think?
Yes. Of course, you can always ask questions next week. You can reach both Dirk and myself under our email addresses. We're easy enough to find. Ask us any questions there. Christian Konz is there to help us along. So there's plenty of opportunity to raise your questions. And we're very much looking forward to actually starting this European round next week with Barbara Buchenau from the University of Duisburg-Essen. And we can perhaps go back to what we talked about today, maybe introduce a session with a little bit of a warm-up of what we talked about today, and then talk to Barbara about her ideas. Okay.
Excellent. Don't forget to bring your own lunch for these sessions, right? This is why it's a Brown Bag lecture series. Yeah, we are looking forward to see you all again next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you then.
You are currently the only person in this